Hi, my name is Jaynee Hodgkins. I'm a registered nurse. My background is on oncology and hospice, and the reason I was attracted to that was because it was looking at people from a holistic approach. It led me into brain integration therapy, partly because I was interested in the whole person, and partly because I had a set of twins who had been prematurely born, and it had some effects from that. And brain integration therapy helped them tremendously in school and in life. And I then myself went through brain integration and found that it helped me a great deal. Brain integration started about 50 years ago by a couple doctors who were medical doctors, Dr. Doman and an educator, Dr. Delicato. They determined that people that had had head injuries, whether it was via stroke or accidents, they wanted to find out how they could relearn activities they had lost. What they determined to do was to find out how infants had learned these activities, and they found out that they learned them through physical movement, that children weren't actually born wired for these activities, but they became plugged in through physical movement. And what we find out is that movement has a lot to do with the precursor for learning. These doctors went across all the continents and looked at infants crawling, and they mapped out their brain, and they found out that when they did the movement of crawling and looking up, that they were stimulating the brain centers that had to do with vision, and that when they would turn to the side to listen to their parents, that they were actually stimulating the brain centers for auditory processing, and that, as kids will do, creeping and crawling and picking things up and putting them in their mouth, that they were actually stimulating those centers that had to do with hand-eye coordination. So by reinventing that activity in an adult, they were able to get the adult to relearn some of these activities of reading, writing, and arithmetic. As a result of that research that was done by those physicians, then Dr. Dennison, who was an educator, took that information and then translated that more into the educational world. The components of brain integration and what it actually looks like then is that we start out with a thorough evaluation, and then we meet for 10 to 11 sessions with a certain category of activity in mind. Perhaps we're working on eyes or ears or hand-eye coordination. And then we do an actual repatterning session, and then they go home and they do the exercises that will then keep what we've done and getting those dendrites in the brain to form and to wire together. Those exercises they do at home will then keep them concreted and gelled in. Now, when we're looking at brain integration therapy, we're looking at organizing the brain in 3 different ways. You can see from the picture where it says the corpus callosum, is it a bridge or is it a barrier? The left side of the brain is more black and white writing. The right side of the brain has a lot of color and shapes and objects. That corpus callosum is the bridge, as it were, in between those 2 hemispheres. And what we know about women physiologically is that our corpus callosum is a little thicker than men, and so that gives more surface area for the electrical conductivity to cross. And so you get a lot more talking left to right brain in women than you do typically for men. The left brain, as you can see, is more responsible for conscious control, words and phonics, logic, math and numbers, groups, categories. It's a very logical, linear side. The right brain, as you can see, is going to be more automatic movement, rhythm, shapes, emotions, daydreaming. We really need both sides of the brain to be able to do reading, writing, and arithmetic really well. Now we're going to talk about back to front integration and what that looks like. The back part of your brain, as you can see from this picture, is responsible for being like the hard drive of your brain. It stores information that you have. The middle part of your brain, or as you can see from the picture, those parietal lobes go back and retrieve that information that you need and then move it to the frontal part of your brain, where you can then synthesize or express what you've learned and recalled. What's interesting about the frontal lobe is that that really takes place in terms of development during adolescence. The first period of time that we see a lot of growth and development happen is from 0 to 3. We all know that babies learn a lot and their brains just overproduce and go crazy. And then the brain kind of prunes back and gets rid of some of the things they don't need. And when they become an adolescent, from about 9 to 24, what we find is there's an overproduction of brain growth happening in that prefrontal cortex. We call it prefrontal cortex lobe maturation. What it means is that they're learning to grow and learn in maturity, in being able to synthesize information and think rationally, and also it has to do with morality, judgment, and motivation. Now we're going to talk about the third way that the brain organizes, and that's from bottom to top. This is one of my favorite ways that the brain organizes. And if you look at the picture here, what you're going to notice at the bottom is that we have the instinctive brain, which helps our body just to do what it needs to do on a daily basis, the heart to beat, for me to breathe without having to think about it. Then we move up into the subconscious brain, which is the dreaming that we have and things that we do subconsciously that we don't even realize why. And then we move up into the emotional brain, which is the limbic system. And this is wonderful because this is these major drives that help us have joy and love and fear. And it's a great place. But if we live in emotional brain, if we live in our limbic system and we're stuck there, then we might be a knee-jerk reactor. We don't want to live stuck in one area of our brain. The goal is to be integrated, to be able to move up and down easily. As you can see, the arrows go both ways on the picture. So that brings us to the next thing we have to look at. We have to look at how do we appreciate the differences? What are some other things that are going to make me learn a certain way that will help me help others teach me, or help me help my mate or my children understand me better? We talked a little bit about right brain versus left brain. Am I more of a right brain learner? I may be a little more artistic. I may see things from a global perspective. I may need to know why I have to understand this. And I'm going to want metaphors and examples when I learn. If I had a fourth grade student that I knew was very right brain and very visual and very kinesthetic, which means a mover, needing to touch and move to learn, I might teach them fractions by teaching them how to cook. They're getting to have their hands in the mess. They're getting to taste and touch and employ all the senses. And at the same time, they're learning something that they're going to be able to use for life. And they're learning math. And so that would be helpful to do. Left brain kids and left brain adults are going to need more information in a logical, sequential way. They may focus on little details. They may be able to listen and not need to worry about seeing it or doing hands-on. And so it's important that we understand, am I more of a left brain or am I more of a right brain kind of a learner? Someone that I found very helpful is Carla Hannaford, who has her doctorate in neuroscience and education. She did her whole doctorate on dominance profiling and looking at what was their dominant eye, ear, hand, foot, and brain, and looked at how that impacted how they best learn. Did they need to sit in one spot in the classroom? Did they need to be able to turn one ear to be able to hear? Were they a kinesthetic mover? Did they need to be able to sit in the back of the classroom so that they could move and still be able to process that information? So that is another really helpful thing to know. And that's something that I do with clients that come in and sit down with me. Another area that I like to look at is, are they an introvert or are they an extrovert? An extrovert is really not just are they cheerful at a party or are they more quiet. It's really about how we energize and refill our energy banks. We know now, based on research, is that there's actually a lot of different brain chemistry and brain activity going on between an introvert and an extrovert. An introvert will process information kind of like spaghetti. It will take a long, circuitous route in their brain, whereas an extrovert will process information in short spurts, like a little macaroni, and they're able to get the information, take it, process it, and spit it back out. In a meeting, the extrovert may seem more intelligent, and an introvert may feel kind of silly because it takes them more time to process. But in actuality, when we give them that time to internally process, they'll come out with some really valuable information. What we also know about introverts and extroverts is that they have different neurotransmitters or chemicals that get those dendrites connecting and talking in our brain. It's kind of like a lock and key system. If I use the wrong key to get into my house, I'm not going to get in. A neurotransmitter gives us the right, accurate lock so that those dendrites can actually talk and the signal can be passed. Introverts tend to use acetylcholine, where extroverts use dopamine, and if you throw in a little adrenaline, they love it. There's a lot of famous introverts and extroverts in life. Sometimes people will assume that an introvert is someone that doesn't like people, and that's not true at all. There's a lot of famous actors and comedians who really like people and are very internal introverts that need that time to re-energize, but they also like people. Another thing about appreciating our differences is looking at some impediments to learning. What are some things that can maybe affect our learning profile? And that may be something that is genetically wired into us. For example, I'm mixed dominant. Well, so are my two kids. And that's interesting. They're wired genetically to be that way. And that will probably pass on from generation to generation. I have a lot of lefties in my family. And what we find out is that that can sometimes cause some learning disabilities. Doesn't mean that they're not bright, wonderful people, but it can cause some issues if we're not aware of. Other impediments to learning might be auditory processing issues. We find that a lot in kids that have had chronic ear infections, or there are some kids that have liquid fluid in their ears because of allergies. And so they're not hearing it crisp and clear like we would. And that can impact their language centers early on from 0 to 3 when those language development years are so critical. And that's why a lot of doctors will encourage things like ear tubes or looking at allergies to make sure that we're taking care of the fluid in the ears. Those auditory processing issues can affect all sorts of things then. Can affect how I hear my own silent voice when I read, so I have good comprehension. It may affect how I break down the sounds of letters and sounds. It may affect how I hear parts of words. It also may affect my attention, my ability to pay attention. What we know now about attention deficit is that that has a lot to do with auditory processing. So what are some other impediments to learning? There's ADD, there's dyslexia, which are both kind of a mixed wiring of eyes and ears. There may be some kids that are highly verbal and yet unable to express their thoughts in writing. Some people call that dysgraphia when it gets really bad. One thing that I found with some of my really left brain learners is that they may have started school really young and maybe started into that left brain activity of school so young that they weren't really ready for it. And so they get stuck in that try mode. If you remember the picture of the left side of the brain, try mode was there. Those learners get pushed into that left brain activity a little bit younger than they're ready for. Typically, boys develop a little bit slower than girls for that learning, those learning activities. And so what I'll find is that by about 3rd or 4th grade, when we take all of the right brain learning out of the books and out of the learning, that those kids then tend to have some issues and hit the wall. And a lot of times we see that in the handwriting. So handwriting is another area, that hand-eye coordination. We also see it in things like speech issues such as stuttering or self-expression. We might find it in a lack of reading comprehension. We might find it in the ability to remember verbal instruction. We might also find it that they are clumsy or athletically gifted and actually be a non-reader. Other impediments to learning are things like trauma, which is really as perceived by the individual. Something that you perceive as trauma may not be something that I find traumatic at all. And yet we see those in losses of life, in either changes of caregiver when we're growing up, whether that was via adoption or perhaps a main caregiver was hospitalized. Those things can all cause things to become unplugged. Another area of impediments, believe it or not, are highly gifted and talented children. Sometimes that can be an impediment for them for learning because they're so smart. Health issues that we're going to get into a little bit more detail later. Sensory integration issues. Sensory integration dysfunction is worked by a lot with occupational therapists. And what we find with those kids is you'll typically see that they're either very hypersensitive, maybe they need the tags cut out of their pants, or they need the seams in their socks turned inside out because they bother them. Or maybe they're hyposensitive. That may be the kid that runs out into the playground and is a whirling dervish and maybe hit people and not even be affected by it, but everyone else is affected. So sometimes we'll see that kids are either seeking or avoiding sensory stimulation. And then the other areas that can be impacted by learning are nutrition, if we're not getting enough nutrition, if we're not getting enough water. And then there's some things that are different, like gender differences. There's obviously differences between the boys and the girls. Here are a few concepts I really want you to remember from this presentation. First of all, brain integration therapy is based on science. There's a lot of research over the last 50 years that support what we do. Secondly, you're uniquely wired. It's important to embrace that and realize that in a day-to-day basis. Number 3, nutrition affects learning. Number 4, physical movement plays a very vital role in brain development and learning, much more important than we've given it credit for over the last several years. Number 5, health issues and trauma can negatively impact brain development and learning. History teaches us that there's been a lot of really creative and wonderful people that have been highly intelligent, and yet they've struggled in school. I wish you the best of luck, and I hope you make good connections.